Hello and welcome to your lecture for week 2 of OTD 550 research methodology. What do we mean by evidence-based practice and what is occupational science? And I'll be your host today, Brenda Howard. So we're going to be responsible this week for some new definitions. And the first definition we're going to look at is what is evidence-based practice? We've talked about this a little bit, but what exactly do we mean when we say that? We talked about the Brooklyn Bridge and how it's made by individual bricks. Well, each brick is a piece of evidence, right? So evidence-based practice is taking a number of bricks that are letting us know about practice in a particular area, and we're applying them. We're applying this research that is current and methodologically sound to inform our practice decisions and treatment options for our clients. And we want to remain client-centered when we do that, looking at what are the preferences, the expectations, and the values of our client. So it's honestly putting all the pieces together. It's practicing in a way that uses the best evidence, but also uses our best understanding of our clients as we're practicing. So why do you think that evidence is important? I'd like you to put this in your own words. Think about, how do we know that evidence is good? What are the ways that we can tell that the evidence that we're using is something that's good and sound and valid and reliable and going to get the results that we want? And the second thing I'd like you to think about is, where does the evidence for occupational therapy come from? At this point, you've probably seen some occupational therapists at work. Hopefully, you've learned a little bit about what it is that you're going to be doing someday. Where did occupational therapists get those ideas? Did they just make them up themselves? Did they pull from the evidence? Where did they get information about what is the good and right thing to do with our clients? So pause the recording and think about that for just a minute. Let's move on a little bit and talk about, why do we need occupational science? And why do we have this whole profession surrounded around this idea of occupation? What is it about occupation that is so important that we're going to create a whole profession to deal with it? Well, I think some of the reasons for that is that people are occupational beings, that people need occupations in order to feel fulfilled. We aren't just beings, we're also doings. We have to be involved in doing something. So why do you think it took us so long, like more than 50 years as a profession, for us to develop occupational science? We started in 1917, and it really wasn't until the 1950s, that we started to see case study evidence. And it really wasn't until the 70s or 80s that we began to see empirical research studies taking place in occupational therapy and this idea of occupational science developing. So take a minute and think about that, and then I'll give you my take on it. So I think that it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. We actually had to get out there and do occupational therapy for a little bit for us to be able to start to see, oh, this is what's working. And we need to define it better. And we need to find better ways of identifying why it's working. And so we started developing theories, and then we were testing those theories with research. And it gave us this whole concept of occupational science, which occupational science is just a way of looking at people doing things, which is like sociology. My husband, the sociologist, is fond of saying the definition of sociology is people doing things together. So that's very much like occupational science, which is the science of people doing things. So we explore the complexities of the human engagement in occupation. And there are 4 sections to this, and these 4 things are things that you're going to want to remember and make a note of. Okay, they are substrates, form, function, and meaning. And we'll talk about what each of these mean. So let's talk about substrates and form a little bit. Now, this isn't quite true to reality, but it's a little bit of an easy way of thinking about it, is that quantitative research is most helpful when it comes to thinking about substrates and form of occupation. So quantitative research tells us a little bit about the things that are behind occupation, the substrates. A couple of examples are sensory processing and brain abnormalities following traumatic brain injury. Those are substrates. Those are body structures and body functions. They are performance skills and performance patterns that help us look at What's behind occupation? What is it that people need in order to be able to perform occupations? An occupational form is simply, what does an occupation look like? What is the shape that it takes and why? The example that I often use of occupational form is bicycle riding. So when I say bicycle riding, you might have an image in your head. You might picture yourself as a child riding your pink bicycle or your blue bicycle, or whatever bicycle down the road, to hang out with your friends, and your bicycle was your form of transportation. Or maybe you thought of the bike riding that you did last week, on your multiple speed bicycle that is built for speed or built for road riding, and it's less about transportation and it's more about exercise. So the form and shape of occupation might be different based on a number of factors. As far as another aspect of form is who does and who does not participate. For example, what if you're studying older adults and their access to mobile phones and computers? Limited access might mean systemic disadvantages, or limited understanding of how to use them might also mean disadvantages. I think about my mother-in-law, who does not use her computer or her phone to, say, get on her Social Security account. So therefore, when the government says everything now has to come to you electronically, she's kind of stymied as to how to access that information and needs our help in order to do it. Occupational forms can change depending on the shape of the occupation or the individual. And occupational science can tell us about those things. Now, qualitative research might tell us more about the function and the meaning of occupation. So how do people define occupations for themselves? What function does an occupation provide for an individual? So, for example, which occupations help build and define families? Well, in my family, that had to do with cooking. It had to do with faith-based activities. And it had to do with reading and talking about things that we read about. In other people's families, occupations such as sports or travel might be more meaningful to building their family. Meaning, how does the meaning of an occupation change for people as they grow older? We just talked about that aspect in bicycles. What counts as an occupationally satisfying life? And what is the occupational nature of being human? These are questions that might be asked in a qualitative study that gives us information about the shape and the function and the form and the meaning of occupations that we might be looking at when doing an occupational science study. Now, translational science actually puts these two things together. It helps us look at what is the evidence for practicing, and then what does the occupational form or function look like for my particular client, and how can we transform the knowledge that we have to put that together with the individual that's in front of us to help that person have a satisfying life? Well, there is a system for that within occupational science. So here is the flow chart or the concept map from occupational science. This came from a textbook that you all do not have, but if you like concept maps, I thought that might be interesting to see it in this format. I'm also going to put it in a flowchart format for you, and don't let this overwhelm you. The light blue boxes are basically what you saw on the previous slide. It's showing the system and the flow, and then the dark blue boxes are an example. So the steps are, first we're going to identify what occupational problems our individual is having. We're going to compare that to our theoretical understanding, and that might be a theoretical understanding of neuroscience or development or biomechanics, or what we know about occupation. What's the theoretical understanding that we have of the importance of occupation? We're then going to develop an intervention that looks at those aspects. What are the problems our client is having, and what do we know from theory that works to help people get better? We're going to test out that intervention, and this we could be talking about doing in a clinical setting, or we could be talking about doing it in a research setting, testing out that research, creating a research study that's going to test the intervention that we developed for people. Then we're going to evaluate both the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of that intervention. Is it worth the dollars that it costs to put into that? So then we're going to study a theoretical model for why the results happen. So we have our theory of what will work, and now we're post-study, and we're going to look at a theory of why did this work or why didn't it work, and so then what our next step would be. We'll develop that theory, And then we're going to postulate a couple of outcomes and then hopefully see those come to fruition. Outcomes such as now we have a theoretically informed intervention that we have proven that works, and our intervention is now improved over what we used to do in the past. And outcome two is now we have some new knowledge that we can incorporate to help our clients achieve occupation and health. Let me give you an example. So constraint-induced movement therapy is a type of motor learning that looks at how do we get people better after they've had a stroke. It is especially works well for folks who have had light dysfunction following a stroke. But what do we do for people who are more low functioning, who are really impaired in their upper extremity function? How can we help them? Can we adapt constraint-induced movement therapy into a new method that will be better than our traditional old-fashioned ways that was called motor control of helping our stroke patients? So neuroscience tells us that motor learning does work. We've had studies based on that. So there was a new intervention developed called SABO, and SABO is a company. I don't know what the initials stand for off the top of my head. We'll have to look that up. But SABO developed this really cool system that involves a supportive arm and shapes and balls that people then pick up and move around in various planes of motion. And we have a picture of a woman using the SABO system there at the bottom of our page. So now we're going to put into practice SABO versus motor learning. And we can do this in the clinic with a particular client that we're going to try out the SABO system. Maybe we borrow one from the manufacturer and say, right, we're going to try it with 3 to 5 clients. And then we look at that versus our traditional care. Or we could do an actual research study. How does SABO look next to a different type of motor learning intervention? So then we look at the effectiveness of that. Was the intervention effective and how expensive is it? Well, SABO is actually a very expensive intervention. It's an expensive system that you then buy and put into place in your clinic. So then we want to think about, theoretically, why did SABO work? Well, neuroscience. We know from neuroscience that a motor learning approach to rehabilitation that is occupation focused is the best way to go to help people get better. So now we might want to do a qualitative study with those who've been through our program and look at what occupations are they now doing as a result of having been through the SABO program that they couldn't do before. And now we have some more information. So that might lead us to purchase SABO for our clinic, because now we know that even though it's expensive, it's efficacious. And so we want that. We're going to purchase it. And then outcome two, we have some new knowledge of occupation and health that we can use in our clinical practice. And now all of a sudden we're using something new that we hadn't used before. We've put our evidence-based practice brain together with what we know about occupational science. We've tested it out in a systematic way. And now we're putting this new thing into practice. Cool, right? So this is just the same schematic in a little bit different format. It goes horizontal instead of vertical. I want you to stop the recording and think about an intervention that you've seen before. Maybe in one of your observations, or maybe something that you've read about. If you don't have anything in mind, then go to the AOTA website, go to OT Practice under the publications, and just look up a new intervention and see how people are using it. And think about how might you test that out if you were going to test it out in clinical practice. So how does in occupational science inform occupational therapy? Well, I've got some links here that I'm going to just let you take some time to explore. There's a lot of information out there with critical appraisal papers and critical appraisal, I think they're called templates. I think that's what the T stands for, that look at basically how do we translate this knowledge into practice. So some of the people have done the work for us. So when we're in practice and we're really busy, we don't have to go searching the literature for ourselves all the time. We can look at one of these sites and go, I wonder if anybody has looked at in pediatric practice, does this sensory integration technique work? And you can look that up and see if somebody else has done it, if they've already explored the literature for you. AOTA also has a list of systematic reviews that have been produced that can also help you with compiling the knowledge that's out there. This, to me, is a great reason to be an occupational therapy member, because they make your job easy. They have these resources at your fingertips rather than you having to go out there and create them for yourself. AOTA also has their Practice Smart campaign, which has some knowledge translation research into basically things that we shouldn't be doing, things that we should no longer explore. For example, motor control was the way that we used to treat stroke patients, but it's not very occupation based. And they're saying, well, now we should be looking at more of a motor learning approach. Why is it, though, that it's so hard to get evidence-based practice things into our practice? Well, for one thing, it takes time. And when we're busy clinicians, we don't always have that time. So that may mean that there's not a lot of support from fieldwork supervisors, supervisors and administrators, because they're like, I just need you out there making the dollars because that's what keeps the lights on, makes the world go round for us. It's also not always valued by everybody. It could be that there's just not a lot of value. We've always done it this way. It works. So we're just going to keep going with what we've got. It also can be expensive. AOTA membership does cost us some money. And sometimes their best evidence is behind a paywall. And that's because it costs them something to produce this evidence. Sometimes search accessibility is difficult. Sometimes people don't have access, say, to a library search database. Not everybody has access to that. You also sometimes will run into older practitioners who are like, you know what, it's always worked this way for me. I'm not going to try anything new now. And they're committed to this expensive, outdated equipment that they bought 20 years ago. And hey, it's still working. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So sometimes we have to work to get past those barriers. Sometimes there are also international barriers. The articles that we want are not in the language that we speak. And then there are also, it's expensive for folks. And I think about, say, folks in Europe who are trying to get access to AOTA and don't have that ability because, they're not members. So there are some barriers to evidence-based practice, but we can do things to get around those barriers. For one, we can advocate for the time. And one of the ways that we do that is by showing the results, showing how we've been able to take something small, look at that one brick and put something into practice that we've read about and talk about the results that we've seen from that. And just, hey, if we just start a journal club and start incorporating some new information, we can have the best evidence without a lot of time, but by putting a little bit of time and by banding our brains together to look at this information. Creating your own support network. I am part of a vestibular rehab online study group with occupational therapists from all over the country. And we are sharing articles with each other on about a monthly to every other monthly basis about what's new in vestibular rehab. And since I'm not in practice anymore, I can learn about what's going on in practice by taking part in that journal club. And it's really a pretty cool way to meet other people. And then I can connect with them at conferences and things as well. So create that support network, even if it's outside of your own geographic area. Again, you can create a journal club. I've been part of these within work groups, team groups, interprofessional groups that I've worked with before. Sometimes you can go to workshops and somebody else has already done the job of collecting the evidence for you. So get that information from them. And then it also helps to set your own deadlines. Don't just be like, oh, I'll look at that someday. Be like, I'm going to get this information by the end of the month. Also, you can write your own CAP or CAT paper and present it at, say, the Indiana OT Association conference. This may not sound like something that, oh gosh, I'm ready to do that right now. But in your future courses, you're going to actually be doing things where you collect this kind of information. By the end of this semester, you will have collected a body of literature on a particular topic. You can share that particular literature. That is not research, but it is literature review. And it is bringing that evidence together for evidence-based practice. So even when we are not creating the empirical research ourselves, we can be sharing the evidence that we're finding with others. And that's a very important thing to do as occupational therapists. So here's my references. Thanks for listening today, and I'll see you soon.